Hello, my name is Bree, and this is My Economics. So what is economics? Well, economics is not a math class. It is just the study of how people make decisions in the face of scarcity. And in microeconomics, it is more of a focus on individuals and firms and households versus the economy as a whole. So how do people make decisions in a world of scarcity? Well, I understand scarcity. I learned about that in my sociology class. Resources are scarce, especially natural resources like natural gas and lumber, even like diamonds and opals, but resources like education as well. And during COVID, toilet paper was a scarce resource. And being that I am myself a consumer, the budget constraint made sense to me. But when I started seeing all these graphs and the stuff about production possibilities frontier and that terrifying idea of opportunity cost, I started to think, hey, somebody lied to me when they told me economics wasn't a math class. But I'm glad I stuck it out because by the end of the course, a lot of this stuff made a lot more sense to me. So, supply and demand, something I thought I understood, but ended up being probably the most confusing thing in the entire course. I got really fixated on the math aspects of it, and I wasn't really thinking of it intellectually. And what made a huge difference for me was when I figured out that supply and demand curves are not the same thing as quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Labor and financial markets was another chapter where I was a little confused trying to interpret all the supply and demand curves. But by the end of the course, I can look at a chart, fairly easily find the point of equilibrium. It was really interesting to learn that a lot of economists think that minimum wage causes unemployment, because I really disagree with that. I feel like minimum wage is something that we definitely have to have in our economy. Moving into elasticities, and when I initially read this chapter, all I could focus on was this huge daunting equation, but with practice, it made a lot more sense. Learning that all it is saying is it's the percent change in the quantity demanded, that's quantity demanded, over the percent change in price. And really, to simplify it, elasticities is just showing how responsive one economic variable is to a change in another economic variable. I can understand that. In perfect elasticity, that horizontal line, store that in my memory for later chapters. Here we go with consumer choices. Okay, I can track this. I'm a consumer. This makes sense. And here I recognize this, the budget constraint or the budget line. And we're talking about how much total utility or satisfaction I can derive from different choices. The idea of utility maximizing, too, is another point where I definitely differ from the way economists think. Because what if I don't want to spend all my money? What if I want to have a little less of this and save some for later? And that's not really the way they think. And marginal utility, which is just the change in total utility divided by the change in quantity. And little did I know, this word marginal would end up becoming my favorite word in the entire course. And just a side note here, I could definitely take an entire course just on behavioral economics and the psychology behind how people make choices. That was cool. And moving into the part of the course where we start talking about like all the businessy stuff and the LLCTE, land, labor, capital, tech, and entrepreneurs. Now, there's a ton to unpack in this chapter, but I see my favorite word pop up again, marginal, talking about marginal costs, and some charts I can actually do the math on. That makes sense. And a graph that I kind of like, where we're learning about short run and long run costs. What can I do today to make a change, and what's going to take a lot longer for me to change? At this part in the course, we start learning about the 4 different market structures, starting with perfect competition. I really like this market structure because it's just a theoretical idea. No one firm has too much power. There's lots of firms. Everybody has perfect information, and there's freedom of entry and exit. Yay, freedom! And even though there were some graphs and some charts, it was okay because my favorite word popped up, marginal cost. So it's just the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity. Okay, all right, stuff's starting to click. The profit maximizing point is just where marginal cost meets marginal revenue. I get it. This is definitely what the economy would look like in a perfect world. But the world's not perfect, so now we got to talk about the opposite, which is monopoly. On the complete opposite side of the market structure is the monopoly. So the monopoly is the price maker. There are barriers to entry. Pretty much they get to be the bully of the market. At this point in the course, it was kind of fun because some of the charts and graphs started making a little bit more sense to me. So I started getting a little more excited about the direction of the course at this point. Monopolistic competition and oligopoly. I had fun in this chapter because I've never heard the term monopolistic competition before, and it was interesting to find that that is probably the most common market structure we have. A monopolistically competitive firm has differentiated products, but they can still kind of set their own price. And then having a look at this graph made a lot more sense because all I have to do is use my favorite little term, marginal, and find where marginal revenue meets marginal cost. Hey, I got it. An oligopoly is more like car manufacturing companies where there's just a few firms that dominate the market. I see this a lot with like car companies and phone companies. And the chapter on antitrust policies was interesting. We got to learn about mergers and restrictive practices, tying sales and bundling. And it was interesting to learn about how Microsoft actually got in trouble for restrictive practices. And then it got me thinking about Apple. When I first started using Apple, I couldn't even run Microsoft Word on my device. So that's definitely interesting. By the time we got into externalities, my favorite word, marginal, was everywhere. So the graphs and charts weren't as daunting. And the term externality was brand new to me, but it just means a spillover effect. And the best example of a negative externality is pollution. I'm kind of a hippie environmentalist, so I'm all for a pollution tax. But I did learn about this marketable permit program where, like a big firm that creates a lot of pollution can buy permits from a smaller firm that doesn't create as much pollution. Whatever works to keep the environment clean, I guess. And positive externalities were cool too because it's the spillover effects from things like education where we're getting a more informed public and more informed voters. And even though I've heard the word subsidy before, I never really considered that it's an incentive for people to do things that have a positive effect on society. And I could relate to the free rider problem because it makes me think of all my friends always wanting rides but never want to chip in for gas. By the time we started talking about labor markets, the stuff in the beginning that had me absolutely frantic, feeling like I was never going to get through this class, started becoming familiar for me. So I saw my favorite word, marginal, and instead of marginal product, we're talking about marginal product of labor and value marginal product of labor, which just means how much more product can I get from adding one more input of labor. And then we finally get to start talking about poverty and economic inequality, which ties right into my major, which is social work. I feel like the government programs meant to help people in poverty are super important, and a lot of people don't understand just how important they are to our entire economy. And tying this into a previous chapter, there's negative externalities involved. If we don't help people in poverty, if we just let people be homeless and on the streets, that's a negative externality. Another negative externality and negative spillover would be that if we don't help people get health care, then there's going to be less healthy people and more viruses. So there's that whole concept that ties into all of this. So that was my little social justice rant, but going into the chapter on insurance and risk information, I found that I was already pretty familiar with these ideas. You know, I've bought cars with money back guarantees. I've been dealt lemons and I have to pay my car insurance. And so this stuff was already pretty well known to me. But I did get to learn one of my favorite terms in the entire course, and it's moral hazard. And it immediately made me think of how the people in Jackass must pay really high insurance premiums. And finally, financial markets. A lot of people in this class probably were most excited about this chapter, but it was probably the one that interested me the least because I don't really have a desire to make money or become wealthy. But even though my goal isn't to become wealthy, I do think that at some point it would be interesting to go sit down with my bank and see what it would take for me to open a CD or invest in some kind of capital. This class has been a roller coaster of emotions for me, really feeling like I was doubting myself, not feeling like I could understand the math and the graphs and the charts, but by the end, really feeling like I do understand these concepts and I'll never see the economy quite the same way again. So thank you so much for everything.